When one door closes, another one closes as well on your nuts. So there I was, stuck back in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. Not entirely the worst place to be. It was my home. Not my birthplace, but I definitely had a connection to the town. I knew a lot of people there. I'd started playing there, and it was sort of a small part of the fabric of the musical community there. And so there I was, late summer 1990, with no job and no prospect, but things kind of picked up because I ended up going back to work for the CBC a lot, and there were I started going into fiddle contests just for the money, and so there was a dozen of those each year, and I'd go in and win first place or second place and every one of them. And there was one guy who's still a close friend of mine. His name is Anthony Rosesco. Wonderful fiddler, tremendous fiddler. And him and I we were always first and second place. If we showed up at the same contest, it was always a big joke between us. Okay, which one's going to get first this time, right? And we were continually, obviously, trying to outdo each other and coming up with new tunes and new arrangements and new, it was a very healthy, happy rivalry between us, and we became very close friends to this very day. And I love Anthony, and he's still playing in Halifax. He's out and teaching and all that stuff. Like, he's never stopped. And so there was a few other things that had happened along the way. There was a girl I had was dating during my second trip to the U.S., I think when I went to college. I was dating this girl back in Bridgewater, and she, I think I explained that she had found me while I was working security at the Bridgewater Mall and asked me out, and we had dated, and I left and went to college. And over that time period, I eventually broke it off with her. And somehow along the way in this time frame, she had gone and contacted all of my other brothers, and she ended up dating Joe. And somewheres along that pathway, they got married. And so that was a bit strange, and I was a little confused as to why any of that happened, but it happened. So it wasn't long before they had a son. She came pregnant and had a boy named Dylan. And so that was all going on. And Joe, of course, had finally moved out of the house permanently. He had been in and out of the house with Mother most of his life. But this time he was kind of gone for good. He left He left Halifax, where he was working with Dave and Bob, and moved back down to Bridgewater, where he knew he could secure a good job, which was driving cab for one of the high-end cab companies in town. Henderson's, it was called. It's a 2-car operation, and they had mail contracts, and they had all this, and it was a really good job. And so Joe went to driving cab and living his life. And they had a beautiful little basement apartment in this house. So that was all going on. So I thought, well, even I think Bob at some point was even driving cab in Bridgewater. So I went and applied for a job with Plaza Taxi, which was the biggest company in town. It was run by a fellow named Roy Canuck. And it was pandemonium. It was one of the funniest things I'd ever experienced in my life. Me and Bob and Joe, and actually a couple of my school buddies, all driving cab in the same town, sometimes on the same shift, and it was hilarious. You could have made a movie just out of that. And there were some weird things that happened during that period. There was one night I remember I wrecked 2 cabs. Not my fault, but I did wreck 2 cabs. The first one was strange, real strange and frightening. I was driving down the highway on the main provincial highway one night in a thick fog, and I was coming up this hill, and the fog was so thick, and I seen headlights at the top of the hill, and I thought, well, he's coming over the hill. There's a car coming. He's in the other lane. When I got up close enough, I realized, and I wasn't going that fast. I was probably going 80 or 90 clicks, and when I got up to the top of this hill, the goddamn car was in my lane, and it was stopped. And I had just a few seconds to react, and I hit the shoulder, went off the road, the car spun out in the ditch 3 or 4 times, and car wrecked. So I get out of the car, and I crawl up the embankment to this vehicle that's running in the wrong lane with the headlights, and there's a guy in the car passed out, drunk out of his mind. He's passed out. I didn't know he was drunk till he woke up, but he did wake up, and I turned the car off. I got on the radio, called the police, called Roy. I went in and it was a Cadillac. I went in and took the keys out, put them in my pocket. And this guy started to come to, and he was like, "Where's my keys? What's going on? Where am I?" And anyhow, he ended up chasing me around the car for 5 minutes trying to get the keys back. And by that time, the cops came and arrested him. And I always thought to myself, somebody tried to murder that guy. He didn't drive to that location, dead center of the wrong lane, and just fall asleep in park. That didn't make any sense. Somebody drove him there and put him in the goddamn driver's seat and left him there to get killed. I've always said that. I don't know who that guy was, or if he's still living, or what happened to him. But that was one of the strangest, most frightening things I ever seen. It was like, what's going on here? And then another one that was really funny. I pulled up to the stoplights on one of the main intersections in Bridgewater one day. I was driving Roy's brand new Ford LTD taxi. And he wouldn't let anybody drive it. He let me drive it. I was like, wow, this is cool. So I'm driving this brand new cab, sitting at the stoplight, first car in line, and there's this huge hill off to my right that goes up the it's Victoria Street, goes up the hill to the top of the town, and right beside this street there's a parking lot, and there's cars parked up at the top of this lot, and I'm sitting there at the stoplight, and I just happened to glance over to my right, and I see this car coming down the hill backwards, and a guy chasing the car. And I had nothing. I couldn't do anything. So I just sat there watching this car come down the hill, gathering speed, out of the parking lot, ass first, T-boned this brand new cab on the passenger side. Just destroyed my cab. And this guy, he had parked, got out, left the car in neutral, forgot to put the handbrake on, was walking across the street to the tavern, and he looks back and sees the car rolling down the hill, and he had no chance of stopping it. So that was pretty funny. I called Roy and said, I just wrecked your cab, and he would have normally gotten mad at everybody, but not me. He came out and saw what happened, and he knew it wasn't my fault. He's just like, go back to the house, get another cab, So he drove me back to the depot, and I got another car. Lunenburg County in those days was a very diverse place musically. It was a tough place. It was populated by, hard-working people, fishermen, lumberjacks. It was a labor town. Like, a National Sea was in Lunenburg, and there was just hundreds of fishermen and fish plant workers, and there was a Michelin plant in the town. It was a very industrial, labor-oriented town, and people were just tough as nails, and it mattered to them. There was people in town that were, proud that they were known as the baddest ass guy in the county. And there was a lot of those type of people there. And it was a real old Wild West place. But the music, the culture of the music was really strange. Like the older people loved country music. There was a community cable network in Lunenburg County called Tri-Town, I think it was called. And they had their own channel and their TV station. And so there would be local music played on this thing by everybody from fiddlers to some of these mainstays, these famous, people from the last generation, like Fiddlin' Jim Ham, who was a tremendous fiddler, who was also a trick fiddler, and another guy named, they called him Little Buddy. And he had a hit in the 70s called my cabbage boiling home, or cabbage stomping, or whatever the hell it was. It was about making sauerkraut, which the county was famous for, and the Dutch lineage, right? The Lunenburg County they were Dutch settlers. Some people claimed they were a prison ship crashed there, and that's the people that settled the area. I don't know if that's true or not, but they certainly had their lawlessness about them in those days. It was just could be a tough place to be, especially driving cab. But the music, there was all of that. There was fiddlers around. There was all sorts of things. But the really amazing thing about Lunenburg County was the number of really good rock bands that came out of there, and that came there. Like, there was a lounge in Bridgewater called Tomorrow's in the mall. I described it in one of the earlier episodes, and that lounge had some incredible bands come through it. Bands like April Wine and Trooper and the Screaming Trees, and a band called Sandbox, who, incidentally, the guitar player in that band was Bubbles, Mike Smith from the Trailer Park Boys. He was one of the founding members of Sandbox. And there was another band in town called Clearshot, and they were very popular, and one of the leaders of that band's name was Scott McCone. And Clearshot, they'd done well. They'd made some records. They had a good promotion and good publicity, and they played a lot. And Clearshot was sort of on the way out, like slowing down. And I think I answered an ad, or actually, I'm not sure exactly how it started. But I ended up going over to Scott McCone's house one day to sort of audition for a band idea he had, which wasn't a band at all. It was him. He wanted to do him and one other guy and program drums and bass and keyboard parts on this, what was then cutting edge equipment, a sequencer and all this computer equipment that you just turned on, and he could control it with a foot switch, and you could play and sound like you had an entire band behind you. So that was right up my alley, because I was already I was a multi-tracker pig. That was my idea of fun. So I went over there, and sure enough, we started a band. It was a duo. Started out called Double Trouble, but then we realized we were stealing Stevie Ray Vaughan's band name. So then we decided to call it Two for the Road. And strangely enough, I mean, the band, we were really good. It was a really good act. This two guys, two electric guitars. I also played a bit of acoustic and a bit of banjo. And we did this repertoire of everything from the Beatles up to the Police and everything in between, Bryan Adams and some country and and it was a very diverse set list. And amazingly, brilliantly on Scott's part, he realized that a two-piece band had a lot better chance of being hired in the clubs than a four-piece. So it wasn't long before we were represented by an agency in the city and playing all over the place. We're staying really busy and making, pretty decent money on the side with everything else that I was doing. And so we were driving around in this horrible Ford Econoline van that was just barely running. I don't even know where the hell we got it. Maybe Murray gave it to us. I can't remember where we got that thing, but it was tremendously bad. And there was a few times we weren't sure we were going to make it to the gigs. And I remember one gig in particular where we drove in the middle of the winter, drove all the way up to Trackety, New Brunswick, and played in this high school for high school kids that absolutely loved the show. And the van just barely made it. There was 2 feet of snow on the ground. I think we went to the hotel that night, couldn't get in, and ended up climbing through a window, which I stuffed Scott through head first, trying to get into this motel so we wouldn't freeze to death. And just all sorts of shenanigans. We had a blast. It was a great time. And I loved playing that music, and it let me expand my electric chops, which I really loved. And I always played electric because of Chet. But this was a way for me to learn popular music, right? Which was easy for me because there's not a lot of complex guitar work in rock and roll, really, unless you start getting into the guys who were shredding, which I already was into through another friend of mine named Graham Levy, who was a massive Yngwie Malmsteen fan, and Joe Satriani and Steve Vai and Randy Rhoads and all these guys. So I spent about a year and a half just in that electric vein in my head, which was really good for my playing in other styles. The other thing that I was doing at the time was I had a friend who had a DJ company. His name was Rick Lonis, and he worked up at the top of the hill in town at an alternator repair shop. And Rick was just one of the finest men I ever met in my life. And he had a DJ service, which then he bought a stretch Lincoln limousine, which was of questionable quality. It was quite old, but it looked good and it ran well, sort of. And so I went to work for Rick as a DJ. So I ended up, and we stayed busy. We were, doing weddings, and there were several clubs in town where I got regular gigs as a DJ. So I learned all about that. I learned all about what was current on the radio and how to spin vinyl. It was literally old school DJ, dual turntable setup, a little bit of CD, a little bit of I can't remember what, there was another format we were using, and but it it was a ton of fun. It was hilarious to sit there and watch people get drunk and dance and make arses of themselves, and also kind of broke me into talking to the audience through a microphone, which I wouldn't do that often because you didn't have to, but once in a while you would end up doing it. And it was a strange feeling being a DJ because it was almost like I had no responsibility to the audience. I was actually there as an observer. And I don't know how to describe it. It just felt weird being there, causing all these people to drink and dance, but not doing it with my hands. Just doing it with equipment, right? It was a weird feeling. It was like a performance because you had to set a playlist and you had to keep the thing moving. You had to keep the night moving. You couldn't play too many, high energy things in a row. You had to have a slow dance every once in a while. You had to, and it taught me something. It taught me how to build a set of my own when I was later on, when I was performing as a solo artist. That's where I took a lot of my knowledge from, was okay, I know how people react to different tempos, different style, different how to keep them up all night long, right? A lot of learning went on during that process, and near the end of it, I think Rick actually bought a karaoke machine as well, which I think by the time that happened, I was moving on in the world. Didn't get to take that out very much. I don't remember if we did. But so that's all of that stuff's going on. Like I'm driving cab. I had fell in love again in the town and had moved in with a girl in town, and which my mother didn't appreciate. Mother was just the same as ever. She was always starting a fight with one of us, and she was kind of alone. She'd been alone for a while. And me moving out with a girl, and Joe being married with a girl, and Bob not even whatever. I don't know what Bob was doing then. I think Bob was actually, at that point in time, was he owned a Baxter's Milk franchise and was a milkman. He owned his own. He bought into it and bought his truck and had a milk run. And I used to go with him, I think, sometimes on that. There was just so many things, and all I was trying to do was just keep money flowing, which was fairly easy to do. And then so I was playing, I was CBC, I was just working as much as I possibly could, but there was something missing. It's hard to say, like. There's been so many times during my life where I could have easily just stayed put and done that for the rest of my life. At that moment in Bridgewater, at the age of 21 years old and 22 years old, 90 and 91. I could have just stayed there. It would have been fine. I could have worked all these various jobs. I probably would have expanded my musical performance. That would have grown to whatever. But the key point, I think, at that juncture was I wasn't writing songs then. I was, but they were no good. And I didn't quite have the right life experience at that point to write realistic, believable songs. It's strange how, I say this all the time during this series. It is very odd how simple things can change the whole direction of your life. So my simple thing was that the Chevette car that I bought from Donald Franks in Mississippi was starting to wear out in a meaningful way. A matter of fact, me and Bob were driving down the road one day, and the ass end of the car let loose. The axle, tires, springs, everything fell off and flew up in the air, and we were dragging, the car just skidded to a stop on the gas tank. The whole ass end of the car, it fell out, and we got that fixed, but I knew the car was on its last leg, so I started looking around for another used car. And I found one. I found a little Honda Civic that this guy wanted to sell for $2,100. I didn't have $2,100, but I started thinking about things, and it was getting to be late summer. And I was the girl I was living with, that fell apart, so I ended up moving back to Mom's. And it seemed, obviously I was trying to get away from Mother. Every time I ended up living there with her, I couldn't really hack it anymore. Because I was a grown man and I wanted to do my own thing, and she wasn't going to let that happen. And that was always the way with her. She just, she continually fought with one of us all the time. If she was mad at one guy, she was in with the other guy, and she was never happy with all the boys at the same time. She had to split us into teams and camps and warring factions all the time. And she never liked any of the women that we were ever involved with. And she made that very apparent to the women and to us. And it was always just a complete shit show with her. And it was getting, at this point, what ended up happening was I decided to buy this car and I didn't have the money. And this is another case of somebody doing something for me that they shouldn't have done, but they did it anyway, because they somehow knew that they should. I don't know how they knew, but they just did. And I went to a finance company that was a very small finance company in Bridgewater, and I went to ask for a loan to buy this car. And I was completely honest with this guy, because as soon as I made the choice to buy this car, I decided I can get back down to the States with this thing real easy, because it was a good car. It was in great shape. It only had 120,000 kilometers on it. Honda Civic, indestructible. So I went in this finance company's office and I talked to this guy. He was the only guy in there. And I was dead honest with him. He said, well, here's the payments and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I'm probably going to, as soon as I get this, get my affairs in order here, I'm going to leave and go back to work in Alabama. And he knew right away that I was never going to be able to pay this loan back, at least not quickly. So he never batted an eye. He was just like, okay, that sounds good to me. He said, if you miss a payment or whatever, just let me know how things are going. And he gave me the money. I went and bought the car. And I made the payments while I was in Canada. I stayed on there and the rest of that year. But him and I think both knew that once I left the country that would be it. And he was fine with that. I never heard, okay, well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But anyhow, that fall, late fall, getting into winter, November, December, I looked at Bob one day and I said, I'm going to go back down and work for Enoch. You should come with me. Because Bob had just quit his milk job. He couldn't make any money at it, and it was a huge expense, and he got into a fight with Baxter's, and they wouldn't support him, and blah, 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 and that all went south, and so he quit that job, and he was either going to, be forced to take a different job in town or move back to Ontario. And I didn't really want Bob to go back to Ontario. I loved Bob with all my heart. He was just the guy to have around, all the time. And so I looked at him one day and I said, I think after Christmas I'm going to go back down to Alabama. You should go with me. He was like, well, what am I going to do? I said, well, you'll find something. I mean, I've been working down there and playing music. I mean, surely to God, there'll be, you can come down. At least if you don't like it, you can come home. And so after that Christmas, the decision was made. And so about mid-January, we got in that Honda Civic and packed everything we could possibly pack in it. A lot of weird shit that's, meant obviously that we're not coming back to Canada anytime soon, and head for the border. And like another thing, they should have never let us across the border. We had no paperwork. We said we were going to Boston to visit our uncle, which we did, but the car was filled with everything. It had like a whole bunch of shit you just don't travel with. Stuff you need for everyday life. Like all of our clothes, all of my instruments, all of my... I think I took my Nintendo game system with me. There was so much stuff in there that was not clearly not for a short trip. And the U.S. immigration caught us at the border and they split us up. We had a lot of money in traveler's checks, a couple of $1,000s I think I had raised. And they asked us, I guess, I don't know what they asked me what was going on. And I just told them, I said, we're going down to Boston. We're going to stay a little while with my uncle and come home. And I guess Bob told him the same thing, but probably not. God knows what Bob told him, is he won't lie. And they let us through. I couldn't believe that. I could not believe that those guys actually let us across the border. Again, it's just like the pathway was opened for me when it shouldn't have been. We should have never made it across the border with that carload of shit. But we did. And we headed for Boston. We stopped and see my Uncle Joe for a few days. And then off we went from Boston to Wagerville, Alabama, to start this new chapter that we had no idea what we were getting into. I certainly didn't, and Bob didn't. It was a fairly uneventful trip. We got down there and went straight to Enoch and Margie's house, and from the very beginning of this particular trip, things weren't quite the same. For one thing, I think the main thing that had happened since I'd seen them last was their oldest son, Wayne, who was a Vietnam vet. He was living in the trailer back in the woods in their bluegrass park, which during the summer was used as a food stand for the festival. But he was living in this trailer, his mobile home, back there. And he had severe PTSD and a lot of problems and whatever. God knows, like, what he saw over in Vietnam, but it couldn't have been good. And he shot himself back there in his bedroom with a handgun. And Emmett Sullivan, the banjo player I've been talking about so much over this series, he found him. He found Wayne back there. So it was deemed a suicide. But the strange thing was that this man was shot in the back of the head. And Emmett found him laying on the bed in that back bedroom, on his back, in repose, head on the pillow, with all this foam coming out of his mouth. and the bullet had lodged in the roof of his mouth. But they still said it was a suicide. I don't know what happened to that man, and I guess nobody will ever find out. But that put an awful kink in the whole family, and there was just a pall over everything, and just felt really weird. And we got there, and there was very little work. There was no gigs. Me and Bob very shortly ran out of money. And where did they put us to live? Back in that trailer. Me and Bob ended up living in that mobile home, and I was sleeping on this bed where they found Wayne. So it just seemed to get worse from that moment on. We ran out of money, and Enoch and Margie, things just weren't the same. There was a lot of really bizarre things going on for that first few months, and the work wasn't there. There was one point where we had no money to buy food and had no food. Enoch and Margie were somewhere on the road without me. I don't know how that happened. And Bob and I were reduced to borrowing a .22 rifle from somebody and going out and hunting rabbits, which don't have a lot of meat on them in Alabama. And so it got really weird really fast. But that weirdness, that strangeness that pervaded the whole scene in the first 3 months that we were there, January and February and March, was actually the prelude to not only the rest of my life, obviously, but the rest of my career, the future that ended up being my life. If it hadn't happened the way it did, I doubt that I'd be here right now doing this. This is that 3 month period in the January of 1992 was the beginning of something quite incredible, and I think I'm going to save the body of this story for the next episode, because there's so much to tell that, it's going to take a while. But I have to commend Bob, because Bob always was sort of on my side. Joe always was on my side. Joe had to live his own life, and by this point, I kind of fell out of touch with Joe because he was married, he had a baby. His life was on its way. Like he was doing what people do, and I wasn't. I was still unsettled, trying to figure out how to maintain or even get started some kind of career that would allow me to do music full time. And Bob was always just a guy with no fixed address. He was an adventurer like me, and he wasn't afraid of anything. He didn't give a shit. And he was sort of the same spirit as me. And he went down there with me just on a complete whim and put himself in a lot of harm's way, just because he loved me. He wanted to make sure I was going to be all right. And he was ready for a change at that particular moment. And he was like, yeah, sure, what the hell, let's do it. And so there we are, right? End up 3,000 miles from home, living in a glorified fish and chip shack or hamburger hot dog stand. It was a full mobile home, but it was used as a concession stand during the festivals in this park, right? Way the hell back, half a mile dirt road back to this place, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a lot of, maniacs, and well-meaning maniacs, but just, again, like I was ready for it. I was used to it. Bob showed no sign that any of this was a shock to him, or any kind of culture shock, or any kind of anything. Just took it all in stride. And I got to commend Bob for that. Bob was just indispensable to me in this time period, especially the one that we're about to go into in this series. So, yeah, he was full of wanderlust. He always was, and it was awesome that we got to do this particular chapter of my life together. So I don't think it would have been the same without him. Going down that long, lonesome highway, bound for the mountains and the plains. Sure ain't nothing here gonna bite me, and I got a lot of friends I'd like to see again. One of these days I'm gonna settle down. Until I do, I won't be hanging around. Going down that long, lonesome highway, gonna live life my way. Until I do, I won't be hanging around. Going down that long, lonesome highway, gonna live life